You may talk about your Lancers or your Irish Fusiliers, the Aberdeen Militias or the Queenstown Volunteers, or any other regiment that's flying for a war. Come give to me the tartan of the gallant 43, and strolling through the green fields on the summer's day, watching all the country girls a working out the hay. I really was delighted and he stole me heart to war when I saw him in the tartan of the gallant 43.
Few individual regiments in the British Army are as iconic and notorious as the famed, loathed and feared Black Watch, the Royal Highland Regiment, with a controversial but illustrious and action-packed history spanning the aftermath of the 1715 Jacobite Rising to the present day, with many actions such as Culloden, Waterloo and El Alamein in between. Due to such a rich and indeed lengthy history, like the Golden Highlanders, we'll be releasing the Black Watch as 3 episodes, so sit back, perhaps with a dram or two of whiskey, and enjoy. This has been our most requested video to date, and we hope we pay an apt homage to this most famous of Scotland's regiments. The Black Watch story begins with the raising of independent Highland companies recruited from clans loyal to the Hanoverians, such as the Campbells, Grants, Frasers and Monroes in 1725. They stood against a backdrop of a Highland that was, in the eyes of the British government, lawless and, worse still for them, a hotbed and fertile breeding ground of sedition. In order to be distinguished from the English and Lowland regiments, perhaps to seem less of a threat, these companies were clad in dark garments and tartans, causing the Highlanders to call them Amfricadan Duve, the Black Watch. These units more or less served as police, watching for Jacobite sympathisers, protecting the construction of roads and forts in the region, and preventing violence between rival clans. Then, in 1739, a regiment was formed, authorised by King George II, to be formed of men who were, quote, natives of that country and none other to be taken. On the 25th of October, it was titled the 43rd Highland Regiment, under Colonel John Lindsay, 20th Earl of Crawford, and therefore often referred to as Crawford's Highlanders. Crawford was however himself a Lowlander, though popular with the men under his command. At a time when the bearing of arms was a right denied to most Highlanders, following the Rising, the regiment had few problems gaining recruits, if only for the chance to fight and continue their martial ways. The regiment's first muster was at Aberfeldy, Perthshire, 1740, each company dressed in the tartan of its company commander's clan. A memorial was subsequently erected and stands there at the site today, impressive and dominating over the River Tay and surrounding parkland. It is a rugged cairn mounted by a figure that is Private Farquhar Shaw. It is inscribed in Gaelic, reading, "The lands and bens and glens and heroes. This cairn has been erected to commemorate the forming into one regiment at this spot of the 6 Highland companies called the Black Watch, 1740. And from that day, this regiment won many battles in different parts of the world, proving their valour and patriotism of the Gael." Erected in 1887, it was paid for by the people of Aberfeldy and opened by the Marquis of Breadalbane, and was put up in part to commemorate the Jubilee of Queen Victoria. As for the figure stood so gallant atop the cairn, at first glance, Private Farquhar Shaw is a very odd choice, and his story ties in rather nicely with the next part of this regiment's history. In 1743, the British government decided it would send this new regiment to the Low Countries to participate in the War of the Austrian Succession, away from the duties both familiar and accustomed to it, and for which it was well suited. However, rather than tell the regiment the fullness of their plans, the Black Watch was merely told that they would be marching down to London in order to be inspected by the king. The regiment was well received on its long journey down, particularly as it passed through northern England, where it enjoyed ample and jovial hospitality. However, as it went south, a number of rumours began to spread amongst the rank and file that the true purpose of their calling down south was to have it shipped out to the West Indies, a deployment infamous for high disease mortality rates. After their inspection, not by the king, but by General Wade, who was delighted by their smart turnout, a number of men, under Corporals Malcolm and Samuel Macpherson and Private Farquhar Shaw, decided that as they had understood their terms of service to be limited to Scotland, and not desiring to waste away from disease in the tropics, to return back home to Scotland. Initially, they made good progress through the shires and counties of England, avoiding the two main roads north, and moving through woodland to woodland. However, the authorities were hot on their trail. Eventually, the Highlanders were discovered in Lady Wood, Northamptonshire near Oundle. The mutineers did not wish to make the situation worse by killing the king's soldiers, and there was a night of negotiations between themselves and Captain Bell of Wade's regiment of horse. The mutineers declared that they would rather be cut to pieces than submit unless they were allowed to keep their arms and be pardoned. Captain Bell said if they laid down their arms, then they would offer most favourable terms to the Lord Justices. In the end, they obtained their capture by luring away small detachments of men and offering them pardons to fetch more. Though acknowledging that they had taken such action from false and malicious reports, it was decided that the event could not go unpunished. The three main conspirators were taken to the Tower, where they were shot. Some 200 members of the regiment were dispersed to other units for garrison duties in Gibraltar, Minorca, and ironically Jamaica and Georgia. To this day, the debate is contested as to whether it was an act of mutiny, or whether it was down to a fundamental misunderstanding of their service terms. Nonetheless, the regiment was to very much redeem itself through service in Flanders during the years 1743 to 44. Here they were so well behaved that many Flemish villages, upon hearing that they were to have British troops billeted, went so far as to request the Black Watch, and even called on the regiment to protect them from the looting of other units from either side. They were seldom drunk or foul-mouthed, and the Elector Palatine wrote to the King of Great Britain to compliment him on the excellent behaviour of the regiment. In 1745, the regiment gained a new colonel, Lord John Murray, before fighting their first major engagement on the 11th of May 1745, the Battle of Fontenoy. At the rather unsociable hour of 2 in the morning, the Duke of Cumberland marched his allied forces, including Hanoverians and Dutchmen, to oppose the French forces on the field, and at 4 a.m, the Guards and Highlanders of the British Army attacked French positions under the Dauphin, the French heir, in the Vezon woods. The French, some 600 strong, had entrenched themselves well, but the assault force of Guardsmen and Highlanders set upon them with such ferocity, a French officer termed them Highland Furies, and declared them more violent than a stormy sea. They cleared the French from their positions with sword, bayonet, pistol, and amongst the Highlanders, the dirk. The Black Watch was noted to have killed a very large number of the defending force. However, the French elsewhere were not done for the day, and under the skilled Field Marshal Saxe, launched a successful counter-attack which pushed the Allied forces well back, which the Black Watch helped to cover, providing a sturdy bulwark behind which the Allied forces could regroup in good order, which they did. During this time, however, one Captain John Campbell of Carrick, an accomplished gentleman of the day, no less gallant amongst ladies than he was brave among men, even a poet, had his head blown off by a cannon shot. During the battle, the French deployed very effective cannon fire, so much so that the regiment's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Sir Robert Monroe of Fowlis, asked the Duke of Cumberland if his men could fight in a manner they were accustomed to, namely dropping to the ground to avoid musket and cannon shot before quickly leaping up to return fire and charge. Monroe, however, being a mountain of a man, decided that it would be too much hassle to be getting up and down, and so instead, whilst the entire regiment took cover, he remained standing. The impression made by the Highlanders on both the French and Allied forces that day cemented them as the crack troops of the British Army, not least in one hand-to-hand engagement where one Highlander was only stopped mid-killing spree, having split open no less than 9 Frenchmen with his broadsword by having his arms shot off. One of the reasons why the removal of the Black Watch from the Highlands was not a smart idea in the first place was because it is thought that the absence encouraged the arrival of Bonnie Prince Charlie. News of the 45 Rising, or more romantically, Lianach Tialach, sent the British Army scrambling north. However, the Black Watch that had served on the continent was ordered to guard the coast of Kent, as it was thought best not to pit them against their countrymen. This sentiment was not shared back in Scotland, however, where 3 new companies of the regiment were raised in Atholl and Braemar, under Sir Patrick Murray, Laird of Mackintosh. One of these companies fought at Prestonpans, where the government forces were defeated, and the company was annihilated in battle, with its few survivors taken prisoner. Another company was, however, present at Culloden, where it suffered no casualties. Following this battle, however, the Black Watch was complicit in many atrocities committed against the people of the Highlands, burning crofts and laying waste to lands owned by Jacobites. In a dark and sanguine episode of Scotland's history, these tasks were undoubtedly barbarous and, as contemporary sources noted at the time, revolting to their feelings. Known during this period as Murray's Highlanders, after their colonel, the regiment served postings in Ireland and a brief expedition to Flanders again, they saw some action at Hulst, Lafelt and Bergen-op-Zoom, where they performed valiantly in the face of unrelenting and superior numbers of French troops, fighting until 2/3 of their strength had been killed, and were the last to retreat from the city, carrying the governor with them. In 1748, the regiment was renumbered from the 43rd to the 42nd, hence its nickname since the 42. After this, they returned to duties in Ireland, where they again behaved so well that towns requested to have the Black Watch quartered there again. It is thought that the similarity in language, customs, and shared point of origin helped ease relations when often the relationship between the Irish and English soldiers was more than contentious. Upon the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756, the Black Watch was embarked for North America under General James Abercrombie, aware of the less chivalrous nature of warfare in the colonies undertaken by both settled colonists there on both sides and the Native Americans. The 42nd spent much time training in new forest warfare and marksmanship tactics to adapt to new fighting conditions. Their first engagement was to be the Battle of Ticonderoga, where they lost over half their fighting strength in the assault on the fort. Initially they had been held in reserve, but were so angered by the slaughter of their British comrades that they rushed ahead, hacking their way through the felled trees the defenders had placed in their way, and hoisting each other up over the walls, where the French promptly bayoneted them. 42nd were ordered to halt the attack, but initially refused and continued to assault it until they were forced to withdraw. Of the Black Watch, some 17 officers and senior NCOs were killed, and 297 enlisted killed with 27 and 306 wounded respectively. 1758 saw a 2nd Battalion raised, and King George II granted them the honour of being a Royal Regiment, so it was now officially known as the 42nd Royland Highland Regiment. The 2nd Battalion was raised hastily back home and included a number of Irishmen to make up the numbers. Names such as O'Donnell were changed to MacDonnell in order to satisfy their commander that only Highlanders constituted its ranks. After helping to replenish the losses of the 1st Battalion, they pushed on to assault the islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe in January of 1759. At Guadeloupe, the regiment fought alongside the Marines in an amphibious assault on Fort Louis, and then pressed on towards an action at the River Lacron, where the islanders charged the French with their rifles slung on their backs with their swords drawn. So nimble and swift were the attacks carried out by the Black Watch in the Caribbean, that the French thought they faced a force of several thousand Highlanders, not some 800 men, After a brief posting to Canada, which involved securing Montreal from the French, they fought actions on Martinique and in Havana, where they prevailed against a resolute Spanish defence in 1762. In the following years until 1767, the regiment was part of a force quelling an Indian rebellion there by Chief Pontiac, serving around Fort Pitt before sailing to Cork, Ireland, where they remained until 1775. Whilst there, recruiting parties from other regiments, taking note of the Black Watch's popularity and renown, had begun to dress up in the uniform of the 42nd in order to attract more recruits. One regiment, later to become the Staffordshire Regiment, brought a large number of Highlanders to their barracks in Dublin, only for them to refuse to join an English regiment. After a court of inquiry, it was found they had been dishonestly recruited and were freed from terms of service. However, they all quickly joined up to the real Black Watch. It was said that the 42nd had rather tribal accommodation arrangements, and that men from one glen or village would share a room, and the smaller subdivisions of the regiment more or less formed very tightly knit family-like units. When in 1775 the regiment returned home to Scotland, it had been overseas for some 32 years, and the older men of the regiment, who had likely not seen home for much of that time, knelt upon the Scottish earth and kissed it. But before they had long to enjoy home, they were ordered back to America, where the colonists had risen up and thus begun the American War of Independence. During the previous war in the Americas, the Black Watch had fought alongside the settlers, many of them being Highlanders by ancestry themselves, and there was mutual fondness between them. Diaries of the time note with sadness the coming war. The Black Watch in the thick of the fighting during this war, and of particular note was the performance of the Highland Grenadier Battalion. Formed from the Grenadier companies of all the Highland regiments sent, Grenadiers were hand-picked as the strongest, tallest, and sturdiest men in the regiment, so from the Highland units, these were truly the creme de la creme of the British soldiery. The 42nd fought at the battles of Brooklyn, Harlem Heights, and at Fort Washington, where although supposed to be a divisionary force to allow the Hessians to carry out the main assault, the Highlanders just went ahead and attacked the fort, procuring its surrender. The following year they saw action at Trenton and then at Piscataway, where the regiment, though surprised by a massive American assault of 2,000 men, managed to hold them off, their sentries fighting a brave action to let the rest of the regiment get into their gear. Once ready, Black Watch pushed back the attack and pursued them to the American camp, where the rebels were saved only by nightfall, and under cover of darkness escaped the close quarters slaughter. At the Battle of Brandywine, the 42nd took part in a clandestine mission called the Powley Massacre, where they carried out a surprise attack on the Powley Tavern at night. Their commander, Major General Gray, ordered them to remove the flints from their rifles and only use the bayonets to keep the element of surprise till the last moment. It was indeed a massacre, and some 300 Americans were bayoneted and 100 prisoners taken. Gray subsequently earned himself the nickname No Flint Gray. From here, they came to the rescue of the 40th Regiment at Germantown. A year later, the regiment participated in a raid at New Plymouth in 1778 and was present at the Siege of Charleston in 1780, but saw no more action, eventually returning home to Scotland in 1790, having received new colours at Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1784. In 1792, the Black Watch took up once again the grim duty of settling disturbances in the Highlands, and were force-marched into Rothshire in order to quell civil unrest caused by the evictions of crofters from their ancestral lands to make way for commercial sheep farms. To the relief of the regiment, the crofters dispersed upon hearing of the arrival of soldiers, and the regiment was not compelled to carry out any distressing duties. Hostilities with France were renewed at the outbreak of the French Revolution, and the Black Watch was sent as part of a force under the Duke of York to defend the Netherlands from the invading revolutionaries, embarking in 1793 for Ostend. And yes, this was the campaign from which the famous nursery song originates from. First seeing action at Nijmegen in 1794, the regiment then went on to fight at Tuile and Geldermalsen, In the latter battle, the regiment is supposed to have earned its right to wear its famous red hackle, which it wears even to this day as the 3rd Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland, proudly adorning its tam o' shanter. There are numerous versions of how it acquired the red hackle, some even claiming it had been worn during the American War of Independence. However, it is a fact that when back in the UK, at their barracks in Royston, Cambridgeshire, the regiment was presented with a box of red vulture feathers to go in their bonnets, to the widespread delight of the men, in order to mark the King's birthday. That almost concludes part 1 of the Black Watch, with 2 more to come. It is after all a very illustrious unit of the British Army, and we hope to pay it the proper justice. During this period covered, a very famous Scottish march and song was composed. The music written by General John Reid, formerly of the Black Watch in the 7 Years' War, and lyrics by another Scot, Sir Harry Erskine, a soldier and politician, MP for the Eyre Boroughs. The garb of Old Gaul will be familiar to most as the slow march of the Scots Guard, but its lyrics are less widely known and there seems to be no sung recordings. Nonetheless, they exalt the martial prowess of the Highland soldiers and their Celtic roots against the threat of France to Britain's cherished liberty. It was described by Robert Burns as this excellent loyal Scottish song, and is served as the marches of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Queen's Royal Hussars, the Scots Guards, the Royal Scots, the Black Watch, the Ayrshire Yeomanry, and amongst numerous Scottish-originated regiments of the Canadian Army. In the garb of Old Gaul, with the fire of old Rome, from the heath-covered mountains of Scotia we come, where the Romans endeavoured our country to gain, but our ancestors fought, and they fought not in vain. Such our love of liberty, our country and our laws, that like our ancestors of old, we stand by freedom's cause. We'll bravely fight, like heroes bright, for honour and applause, and defy the French, with all their arts, to alter our laws. No effeminate customs our sinews embrace, no luxurious tables enervate our race. Our loud-sounding pipes bear the true martial strain, so do we the old Scottish valour retain. As a storm in the ocean when Boreas blows, so are we enraged when we rush on our foes. We sons of the mountains, tremendous as rocks, dash the force of our foes with our thundering strokes. We're tall as the oak on the mount of the vale, are swift as the roe, which the hound doth assail. As a full moon in autumn our shield do appear, Minerva would dread to encounter our spear. Quebec and Cape Breton, the pride of old France, in their troops fondly boasted till we did advance. But when our claymores they saw us produce, their colours did fail, and they sued for a truce. In our realm may the fury of faction long cease, may our counsels be wise and our commerce increase. And in Scotia's cold climate may each of us find that our friends still prove true and our beauties prove kind. Then, when defend our liberty, our country and our laws, and teach our late posterity to fight in freedom's cause, that they, like our ancestors, bold for honour and applause, may defy the French with all their arts to alter our laws.